Hello, everyone. This is a brief lecture on allophones of fricatives in North American English. And because I'm posting these to a YouTube channel, I do believe the YouTube terms of service require me to start by saying, hi guys, and end by saying, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. You don't really have to like, subscribe, or share. Okay, so we're talking about the allophones of fricatives in American English. And this picks up our discussion of the allophones of North American English more generally. So let's go to the slides. Here we go. Okay, so what kind of allophones of fricatives in North American English do we have? Well, first let's consider the voiced fricatives. Like voiced stops, voiced fricatives may partially devoice word initially and word finally. And just as is the case with voiced stops, when a voiced fricative phoneme devoices word finally, the vowel prior to it becomes longer. And so here we have 4 examples of words that undergo this devoicing process. So first, the word spelled Z-O-O, pronounced zoo. The word spelled V-I-S-I-T, which has 2 voiced fricatives in it, one of which is word initial and becomes devoiced, one of which is word medial and doesn't. Visit. The word spelled O-O-Z-E, that fricative at the end there becomes devoiced in pronunciations like ooze. And that je, that voiced palatoalveolar fricative, that becomes devoiced word finally in words like garage. And you can see in both ooze and garage, the vowel prior to that devoiced voiced fricative has become longer. You can also see here that we're marking the word initial voiced stop as voiceless as well. So the question then becomes, how often does this devoicing happen? Is this something that happens very regularly, like the aspiration of voiceless stops word initially, or is this something that happens more sort of not quite as absolutely? And the answer is, it's not quite as absolute. So you certainly can have pronunciations of words like the word spelled Z-O-O that have a fully voiced fricative in them. Let's listen to some, shall we? Okay, so now what we're looking at are 3 pronunciations of words that end in oo and start with an alveolar fricative. And so the first word is the one spelled S-U-E. Sue, sue. And if we just listen to the fricative portion, well, that had a little bit of vowel in it. It's voiceless. Now, if we move to a version of that with that same vowel and that and an alveolar fricative, but this time the voiced variant, here's a pronunciation of zoo, zoo, zoo. And if we listen to just that fricative, z, 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 you can hear that buzzing sound, and I'm doing this not to clear my throat, but to indicate my vibrating vocal folds. Z, z, z. Then we have a third pronunciation. Zoo, sue, zoo, zoo. So this is Z-O-O pronounced with a devoiced fricative word initially, a voiceless fricative word initially. And so here, if we just play that initial fricative, it doesn't have any voicing in it. It doesn't have that strong buzzy quality like in z, z, z. But most often, people are going to identify zoo as Z-O-O and not S-U-E. There are some other relevant portions of or relevant aspects of this articulation. So the fricative that's devoiced ends up being much shorter than its voiceless counterpart. So if we just measured in millisecond duration, this one, well, it's kind of hard to see here, but this one is a fair bit shorter than the truly voiceless fricative in sue. But the very fact that you can pronounce something like zoo, and it doesn't sound unnatural at all, is an indication that this fricative devoicing is a little bit less reliable than the voiced stop devoicing that we talked about before spring break. All right, so that another relevant point about this devoicing is that if you have a voiceless Z here, the voiceless Z is really the same symbol as S, right? Because S is just, Z is just S with voicing. So if you have a Z and you take the voicing away, you could transcribe it in principle with the S instead of the Z with the devoicing diacritic. But I don't recommend doing so. I think having the voice symbol with the devoicing diacritic will keep things much clearer in your mind, and it's also just much more what is conventionally done where phonetic transcription is used. Okay, let's take a pause here and transcribe 2 words. I want you to get out a piece of scrap paper and transcribe 2 words that have voiced fricatives in them. And let's see, compare your transcriptions to the ones that I came up with. So the 2 words are buzzing and refuse, right? Buzzing, refuse. Oops, I said that second one in the way I didn't want to. Buzzing, refuse, 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 buzzing, refuse, buzzing, refuse. Okay, you can even pause me right now. Let's go over to a Google Sheet that I made, or Google, not a Google Sheet, a Google Doc that I made. Where are you, Google Doc? Oh, you are hidden there. There you are. So here we go. Here's the transcription of buzzing. So this is a voice fricative, but it occurs in the middle of the word, so it's not subject to any of that devoicing. That word initial voice stop is, remember, so that's the voice stop devoicing that we talked about in class before spring break. And so that voiced bilabial stop gets a devoicing diacritic under it. What about refuse? Well, here's what we have for refuse. So first of all, I was trying very carefully to say E in the first syllable and not and so at one point I corrected myself because I said refuse, but that's not what's transcribed here. What's transcribed here is refuse with an E in the first syllable. I probably say it both ways in different speech styles. And so I've marked the stress on the second syllable here. Remember, we're sort of talking towards a bigger discussion of stress. I marked stress on the second syllable here. We're showing that voiced alveolar fricative as being devoiced word finally, refuse, refuse, not refuse, but refuse. And we're showing that oo as having lengthened because it occurs prior to that devoicing. Okay, so a couple of transcription practice items. And if this were a live lecture, I would be taking requests for things to transcribe. Getting back to the notes. All right, so we've gone through that page. Now, here's something that's going to be new, an entirely new diacritic, and that is the diacritic for rounding. So when both the alveolar and palatoalveolar fricatives, so these are s, z, sh, zh, when those occur before a rounded vowel, they become rounded and are transcribed with a superscript W. And so here, let's look at the fourth item here, which is the word soon. So this is the beauty of the video interface, is you can see me say soon, soon. This posture, that's lip rounding, soon, as opposed to seen, soon, seen. Soap, soap. Zoo, zoo, as opposed to the z in zeal, or the s in sad. Here I'm showing the sh as rounded in shoe. Sh and zh are sort of inherently rounded. And so even if I have a sh before e, like in she, my lips are a little bit rounded. That's just the the way that we make that, those palatoalveolar fricatives in English has a little intrinsic rounding to them. But when you put them in front of a rounded vowel, they're even more rounded. Shoe versus she. Shoe, she. You can see the difference in lip aperture, lip opening. And so when that rounding occurs, it's transcribed with the superscript W. Here's a little terminology moment. So the fricatives and stops are sometimes together called the obstruent consonants, or just obstruents. They are produced with a high degree of constriction and therefore obstruct the airflow from the lungs. So obstruents obstruct the airflow. The affricates are obstruents as well, and that should stand to reason given that an affricate is just a stop plus a fricative release. Well, what about those affricates? Well, the first bits of affricate allophones here are just what you would predict given that they're a combination of a stop and a fricative. So they're subject to the same kinds of devoicing rules as stops and fricatives and the same kind of rounding rules as stops and fricatives. So choose, in choose, you have the voiceless palatoalveolar affricate becoming round before that round vowel oo. You'll notice here that that word ends with a devoiced alveolar, voiced alveolar fricative, and so that voiced alveolar fricative is given the devoicing diacritic, and the vowel prior to it is noted as long. The name Judy, there we have the devoicing and rounding. Both you would predict the devoicing because it's word initial, and the rounding because it occurs before the round vowel oo. This is an illustration, the way that I have the fonts aligned here is an illustration of just kind of the inelegance of using these Unicode symbols to do phonetic transcription. It's also a nice opportunity for me to use this tablet that I bought. So if I were transcribing a devoiced j, I would transcribe it as I'm going to transcribe it on my tablet right now. So this time I'm sharing the whiteboard. And boom, we've got my tablet. All right, so where are you, cursor? I would transcribe that as not bad. The tablet is surprisingly hard to use, I can't lie. So that's how I would ideally transcribe that. So let's see if I can transcribe the whole word now. Stress on the first syllable indicated by that mark. Not bad. I'm getting better at that tablet. Okay, let's go back to those notes. Now this last one here is actually kind of a neat one because it's something that, that you see a lot in kids prior to learning to read. So remember, the English writing system is just sort of quasi-phonetic. It's not truly phonetic in the way that phonetic transcription is phonetic. I just touched my face, very bad for COVID-19. And that is when an alveolar stop, t or d, occurs before r in word initial position, it becomes an affricate pretty regularly. And so the words that are relevant here are D-R-I-N-K and T-R-A-I-N. Many pronunciations, certainly my normal pronunciations of those words are, and I'm going to lean into the camera, not because it's important for you to see me, but because it's important for you, it's a cue for you to listen very carefully. Drink, 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 train, train, train. If you listen to that first sound there, it's not drink or train, it's drink, train. It's becoming, it is in that word position, in that phonetic context, it pretty reliably, that T and D becomes an affricate. And the reason that I like bringing this one up is this is something that is very salient to children as they're learning to read. And so I can't tell you how many times I was working with school-age kids where they were learning to read and they were actually becoming very frustrated and very angry because we were giving them words like train, and telling them that the first sound in the word train was spelled differently than the first sound in the word cheese. And so one pair that is sometimes a good way to probe this knowledge in kids is to ask them if cheese and trees start with the same sound. And many times they will say yes. My little nephew, who is not little anymore, the kid's 13 and 5 foot a couple of inches, for him, the word that he was so sort of like, this is where he kind of realized what a false bill of goods the English spelling system is, was dragon. And so, you know, he likes fantasy and role play and all those, you know, nerdy things anyway. So he loved dragons, and he was very upset. He was like, it's not dragon, it's dragon, dragon. And he's right. Okay, so those are the allophones of fricatives with a little bit of affricates, in there as well. And that's what I've got for you. Thanks. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.